David did the handoff perfectly, which is to say that I came in wanting to take this notion of a transdisciplinary look at currency seriously. But first, a quick caveat. Given my background, I am not a scientist and I'm not a scholar, which means I can make no claim to rigor or to erudition. Instead, I am in fact a high-tech entrepreneur, so I can guarantee that I can be provocative, hopefully evocative. There might be a little bit of truth, and if we're lucky, it might actually be useful. So, we talk about the concept of currency, and generally speaking, it is used roughly to mean something like money that we use now. It's actually a very poorly defined concept, and it's used interchangeably, it's thrown around, but also, in my world in particular, we use it to describe all kinds of different kinds of phenomena. Social currency and reputation currency are things that are talked about and bandied about by marketing folks willy-nilly. But even at dinner last night, I actually heard the word currency used 4 different times in 4 different ways, all of which actually seem to make sense. Right? So it could be, it's just a bad use of language, we're not defining our terms well, but it could be that there actually is something actually transdisciplinary, which I mean to say actually mechanism independent, that is important going on here. And David pointed, I think, straight at the middle of it. That is the sort of thing that we can usefully actually do work on at a place like SFI. Now, in order to do a job on that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take on myself all the risk and strip away the concepts from any existing terminology that's out there. Right? So first I'm going to create a little bit of a toy model of the object that I want to work with. Now obviously this is a terrible toy model, but it gets the job done for the purposes of this presentation. And it may very well map to better ideas like complex adaptive systems and whatnot. And if so, please just tell me that on the side. The basic idea is here, you have some sort of agent in a system that has the capacity to input information or energy from its environment, a capacity to process that, identify patterns, and then use that process to deliver on some selection of activities and outputs back into the environment. This is all I'm talking about when I use the word sense-making agent. And each of these different phases are subject to bandwidth constraints, meaning that, for example, a camera can't hear, or that a fruit fly has a limited amount of processing capacity from the things that it can input from its environment. Now, signal is the second object in the toy model. Right? We have information with some kind of intrinsic pattern. We have a signal in the environment. And when signal is intercepted by a sense-making agent, and it generates sense, which is to say that it changes the state of the sense-making agent's behaviors in the environment, I'm going to call that significance. All right, so now we're in a state where sense has been made in the environment. And then finally, when significance encounters some capacity for feed-forward or feedback in the relationship between the sense-making agent and the signal, we're now finally in the domain of what I'm going to define as currency. All right, so to put it slightly differently, a currency is a signal that facilitates the coherent coordination of 2 or more sense-making agents. I'm going to spend a little bit of time drilling down on that, and then I'm going to use this definition to cover a very large amount of ground very poorly. There's actually a lot of meat on this bone, and I really look forward to the rest of the program chewing on different aspects of it. So here's some examples of things that are in this definition. Right? Classic Stigmergy is clearly a currency as defined, as are various flavors of language, both relatively simple and more complex. And then finally, as a special case, money. Right? So when I think about currency, I like to think about the currency and money as different things, and money being a kind of currency. Notably, within the currency landscape is this really interesting notion of the capacity to couple otherwise heterogeneous agents into a new kind of co-evolving object, which I'm going to call convivium. So here we have a flower and a bee, and the flower emits a signal that in fact makes sense for the bee, and the bee can feed back on the flower, and this feedback then generates a new agent on the system, which is a convivium. And that's a very interesting ontological object, because obviously once you have these, depending on the tightness of their coupling and the capacity of their coupling to then act back on the environment, you start building up a substrate of convivia on top of convivia. Now, what is not a currency? There's a number of very interesting examples that are not currencies. And in fact, you can think about the adjective of the notion that something may lose currency, like an idea can have currency, an idea can lose currency. Right? So to have currency speaks to the degree to which a signal makes sense and then leads to a tighter or lesser coupling in this generation of convivia. So on the one hand, for example, in the picture of the monkey, we have signals that are currency for certain agents and not currency for other agents. We have the possibility of signals that don't generate meaningful capacities for feedback, right? So they're just simply signals without, with significance but without feedback. And then we also have the interesting case of currencies that once did a reasonable job of actually conveying sense and driving coherence, which for one reason or another have actually reduced their capacity to deliver that coherence and are now no longer currencies in a meaningful sense. Now, going back to our model of the sense-making agent, this notion of bandwidth constraints turns out to be very important, right? Because if you modulate the different kinds of bandwidth constraints, you modulate the different kinds of currencies that an agent can have access to and use meaningfully in the environment. And it can explore currency space in very different ways, right? So one example is the evolution of the brain, which expands both the portfolio of currencies, the kinds of currencies that are available in the processing element, and also the complexity of currencies that can be dealt with. So, for example, we can think about a vertical increase in currency space. This is an in-depth increase that the peahen can extract more signal from that than you can. Or horizontal, right, with the coupling of different kinds of signaling modalities into a more complex currency portfolio, which gives rise to different sorts of couplings and different sorts of behaviors. And since these convivia begin to have feedbacks on their own environment, you start seeing a very interesting exchange between the currency portfolios, the kinds of signaling modalities and the signal bandwidths, and the kinds of convivia that emerge and how they actually evolve through time. So, for example, to drill down, let's take a look at human beings as sense makers. And I'm actually going to refer to human beings as the Dunbar sense maker. Again, remember, lack of rigor and lack of erudition. I'm probably just destroying this concept. But the basic idea, as I understand it, is that human beings have some soft limit in our ability to maintain high-quality social relationships at about 150. And so what I would say is what this represents is the maximum bandwidth capacity of human beings to effectively use the set of currencies that are associated with our level of convivia, our level of organization, before it gets tapped out. Right? So as you expand the number of human beings in the band past a certain level, we just don't have the bandwidth capacity to operate with that, and that generates various forms of failure conditions. And this is a very complex currency. Right? We're dealing with a number of different high bandwidth, very nuanced feedbacks around body language and facial expression and various kinds of tonality and position in space, all of which is meaningless, right, for a cat or a bug, but is able to be received by this particular kind of sense maker to make sense and then generate a highly effective convivium. Now, of course, one of the very interesting things about humans is that we seem to have the ability to actually feedback very effectively on our environment and take some ownership over not only our bandwidth capacities, but also our currency systems. Right? Now, in prehistory, we see the emergence of different kinds of material culture that expand the bandwidth capacity of our local sense maker and then create an enormous exploration of new kinds of currency space. Right? So, for example, the emergence of arts and language opens up an entirely new domain, a huge niche of currency space that we're still in the process of exploring. And on the bottom right corner, the invention of accounting, right, which we're going to now use as our next case in point, because accounting is in fact what leads us to our modern idea of money. And to tell that story, I'm going to steal wholesale from David Graeber's excellent book, Debt, which I cannot vouchsafe is in fact actually true. So, if it turns out this is completely wrong, ignore the details and just focus on the architecture, because I think the architecture is quite nice. The story that he tells is that the narrative that the economists talk about of the movement from the barter economy to the invention of money is simply a myth. It's not historically accurate. That's not how it happened. Instead, the emergence of modern money was, in fact, initially enmeshed in social currency. Human beings had highly complex personal relationships managed by the Dunbar sense maker, largely stored in memory. And over time, as we began to invent new forms of material culture to explore our currency the currency space, we began to externalize some of these social currencies into different kinds of artifacts, which then dramatically changed our bandwidth capacity, which then dramatically changed the kinds of convivia that we could operate in. On the left, we have a very important innovation, which is the ledger, which Graeber identifies as being the real origin of money, the ability to record debts, not in the deeply contextual social relationship level, but at a couple of levels of abstraction. Right? So we simplify the idea, and now I can owe a debt to Jim, and Jim can owe a debt to Peter. I, in fact, owe a debt to Peter, so I owe a debt to Peter. Peter owes a debt to Jim, and we can perhaps make that happen externally on the ledger and not have to deal with it at a purely social level. Notice, by the way, that the Bitcoin blockchain is a digital ledger that operates as a token. We'll talk about that probably in great detail during this environment. And the right-hand side is another element from prehistory, which is the tally stick, which was another really interesting example of the ability to use material culture to externalize social currencies. In this case, you and I mark down the debt on the tally stick, the stock, we break it in half, and now I hold one half, I'm the debtor, you hold the other half, you're the creditor, and when I settle my debt, we combine them. That vouches for the fact that it was the appropriate debt, and then we destroy it. Now, of course, once that happens, you have an externalizable token that can then be exchanged. In fact, this was a fundamental form of money up until, what, the late 1800s? I mean, it's astounding how long that particular tool lived inside humanity. So one of the big moves from social currency to money was this concept of decontextualization and tokenization. Right? Some force, am I still on? In the fitness landscape, pushed a movement away from social into ledgers and finally into tokens. And it was a gradual evolution of a very long period of time. Initially, we had relatively gross transactions between city-states for settling of broad accounts, but almost all of the accounting was actually still done on a ledger held in the central location. Right? And eventually, of course, this moved through ingots into coinage and into dollars. And it appears that the primary driver for that evolution was scale. Right? In this case, 3 different dimensions of scale. One dimension was increasing population density, increasing overall population. So the Dunbar SenseMaker is tapped out. It can't handle it. And in fact, the ledger finally gets tapped out. There's only so many transactions that can be handled back at home base in Ur. The second is geographic scale. Right? If you're trying to engage in various kinds of transactions 1,000 miles away from home base, having everything backhauled back to the ledger is hard to do. And the final is something that Eric actually explored tremendously, the massive expansion in the kinds of transactions that were occurring. Right? An increasing proliferation, an increasing need to be able to map a currency system that could handle relatively abstract transactions that could no longer be related at all to a deep social context. So then it seems like we may actually be working with 3 variables that relate to each other. One is the underlying complexity of your signaling system, right? The kind of currency modality that you have and the complexity that it requires and the complexity that it can carry. The bandwidth capacity of your sense-making agents, and the scale that you need to deal with. And the scale could be in terms of number of transactions or a space that it needs to cross over. But if you want to increase scale and you're stuck with a relatively fixed bandwidth, then you have to reduce complexity. You have to find new ways to simplify. Right? So this may be a part of the explanation for why modern currency emerged from old school ledgers. Right? Simplify it to grow, complexify to profit. Now, notably, of course, this is in fact a bidirectional move. Right? There are reasons on the fitness landscape for why you would in fact add complexity. So you go from social currency to ledgers to money using techniques, compression, normalization, fungibility, which leads to scalability. But then once money hits the landscape and creates an entirely new set of dynamics, you then see the emergence of recomplexification, right? From simple money to relatively complex, multiple different monetary systems to complex financial instruments and the economy. And in part and parcel of this latter movement was the emergence of the sense-making agent, the firm, right? Which actually has dramatically higher bandwidth capacities than individuals or small partnerships, and that relates very closely to its ability to inject complexity back into the environment for presumably fitness-enhancing reasons. Right? So there are a lot of different interesting considerations. I thought of 2 just listening to David talk, but here are 3 that I want to drill down on briefly. One is the concept of trust. Right? So trust is a very interesting notion in these elements of currency. In just the simple case of ledger to money, in social currencies, in some sense, trust is the currency. right? You know who to trust based upon the social relationships you have, and the social relationships you have modulate the trust that you have. As you externalize that onto the ledger, the trust actually moves to the institution that maintains the ledger with profound implications for social organization. You begin to have to trust the institution, in this case, trust the priesthood who manage that particular ledger. As you move trust further and further out to the edge, then again, profound implications, right? If you move trust finally to the token itself, or in the Bitcoin case, a trustless environment, right? This is a very interesting set of questions, and what does that imply for what kind of convivia take maximum advantage of these different kind of trust environments? And in fact, the second consideration is a problem that arises when we separate the sense-making function, right, the signification, from the sign. Right? So I'm able to use some kind of sign to generate sense-making, but it's possible to mistake the sign for the sense-making itself. And if I do that, it's a fetish. And what can end up happening is I begin to optimize for the sign, not optimizing for the underlying sense-making that actually drives the coherence of the convivium. So in the present example on the left, we have the possibility, which I would suggest is in fact reasonably close to the truth, that we moderns optimize for GDP at the expense of whatever it is that actually makes us want to stick together and work together. You like the guy on the bottom right? That's not real, by the way. That's actually, although it's getting close to real. In a related area is the notion of signal jacking, or I think a better term, a better way of understanding the idea of debasement. If I can take the signal and I can actually modify the signal and get the value out of the signal without actually transacting whatever the original sense-making was, then I again am disrupting the coherence that maintains this convivium. Right? Now, this can take place in the simple form of theft. Right? It's easy to steal gold. It's hard to steal a ledger. Right? So different kinds of currency regimes have different affordances for different modalities of debasement. It can obviously take place in the classic form of the debasement of a currency. And it's interesting to think about now what that means. To debase a currency is to, in fact, render a signal to have less currency. Right? It has less capacity to do the thing that it has done to maintain the coherence of the convivium. And when it goes past a critical threshold, one would imagine a decoherence of that convivium and some new relationships. And then on the bottom left, right, we talked about the fact that the emergence of language gave rise to an enormous and still not at all completely tapped signal capacity. But if we don't actually take care of mapping the use of the sign with the coherence that it generates, we are in fact debasing that signal and leading to some profoundly negative consequences for the convivia that rely on that currency to mediate their relationships. All right, so then let's move to the current state. We obviously now live in an environment that is experiencing some of the largest proliferations of bandwidth capacities and currencies that we've ever seen. And each one of these are different kinds of examples of what happens when you begin to discover some new bandwidth capacity or begin to identify some new currency that's available and then see what kind of convivia emerge around that. So just to take, for example, Yelp on the bottom right, the ability to externalize my personal sentimental relationship within a restaurant experience to render some degree of trust in a person who I don't know by being able to have an architecture that generates feedback loops that provide that, and then be able to act on that generates a new convivium. So Yelp is in fact a convivium that coheres around the reputation currencies that are built into the combination of reviews and ratings and metrics like elite and things like that that enable us to all make sense together. And it is in fact a very powerful agent in its fitness landscape. And if you actually look at the data, the restaurant distribution kind, which restaurants are successful, changed significantly as the number of Yelp users in the local region increases. Which is to say that once a critical mass of your customers use Yelp, if you have a poor review, you're out of business. So to drill down on one specific example, a major phenomenon that's happening in our local economy, our current economy, is a movement from hierarchical to horizontal convivia, a new modality of organization that is enabled by the kind of bandwidth capacities that information technology provides. And I'm going to use Uber as a case study. So I assume literally everybody here is familiar with Uber, which speaks volumes. But the basic idea is that you have an app, you tell Uber I'd like a ride. It has a cluster of relatively loosely connected drivers who have signed a very simple contract, possibly to their detriment, and are attached through an information infrastructure. Right? They have an app on their end. What Uber does not do is Uber does not call a driver and say, okay, drive this person. Instead, what they do is they send out a broad signal to a large cluster, a whole swarm of different drivers, mediated by a reputation score. And they assign each driver a reputation score on, by the way, a case-by-case basis. This reputation is generated algorithmically. It includes the actual legacy reputation in terms of the quality of service the driver is given, how often the driver is actually delivered on getting to you in the time frame that Uber thought they ought to, and how quickly they get you to where they're supposed to get you, but also where they're physically located in space. Does it seem like it's going to take them a long time to get to you, or are they relatively scarce in a place where Uber expects a lot more business to come from? So it's a very complex algorithm that delivers to them a reputation score, and then that then affords the driver an opportunity, or not, to access the bid. Right? And then finally, time. Uber issues out the bid. In this case, our driver with a score of 95 hit the bid before the driver with 100. It's a high enough score to get it in that time frame. They get the ride. Right? And that's who ultimately takes you to your destination. Then to close the loop, obviously, we all sort of experience the transfer of money, but more importantly, for the maintenance of the coherence of the system, is the proliferation of reputation. Right? Uber issues everybody in this environment a whole passel of different reputation currencies, including every individual user, although there's speculation that their reputation currencies for users are still pretty hard-worn. If you can check yours out, see what kind of reputation they give you. The average is 4.9, and in fact, the mean is 4.9, and the minimum is also 4.9, and the maximum is 4.9. So I suspect it's not actually accurate, but it's there, and they can use it. So what we can say is that Uber now is the emergence of some new kind of convivium that operates very differently, obviously, than classic taxi companies, very different relationships, and a dramatically more effective competitive position in the marketplace, which we've all witnessed. But it's only really one step in what appears to be a broader movement. And something that's going on right now, in specifically Uber's circumstance, but more broadly in the economy, is the effort to decentralize even more aggressively, right? To replace Uber as a still legacy element of a hierarchical centralized element in an otherwise highly decentralized convivium with the blockchain. And this is a really cool thing called a decentralized autonomous organization. I'm not going to go into detail on these, which I'd love to. It's worth an entire set of presentations on its own. But the basic idea is that there is a belief that we can use a number of new currencies, crypto tokens, smart contracts, and a whole proliferation of reputation currencies to generate a whole new form of human organization that people here know a whole lot about, but we haven't actually been able to implement very effectively out in the world, which is a fully decentralized organization that human beings are able to coordinate and create highly complex value without any command and control infrastructure whatsoever. Right? That's the promise. And it's not just a pure notion. There are now 50 companies attempting to build them right now across every possible domain. So that's provocative enough, but I figured I'd double down. The last piece is going all the way to the top, and the problem of collective intelligence and us as a convivium in general, right, humanity. And obviously, over the past 30 or so years, we've experienced a gigantic increase in some portion of our bandwidth capacity, right? But it's not symmetrical. We actually have a lot more coming in now than our Dunbar SenseMaker can possibly handle. And that creates a very interesting problem in the current environment, right? Overwhelm. You have how many different signals are now begging for your attention, and this actually leads to an interesting debasement of the quality of the total signal that will be available from the info space that's happening. Right? I guarantee you right now that there are 6 conversations with the people who are in this room that you should be having that you won't have because we can't actually make sense of the signals that are in the environment. However, one can imagine issuing every individual their own personal Watson, right, that does have the input bandwidth and processing bandwidth capacity to grab all of that signal and turn it from noise into significance and to actually generate a whole new convivium, right? A coupling of the human Watson convivium that becomes an entirely new agent in the fitness landscape, and one might hypothesize, a very powerful agent that would be significant in changing how we human beings operate and represent an entirely new stage in the previous narrative. That's all.